Strastvojja, which continues to be about the worst Russian pronunciation you've ever heard. But a welcome anyway to episode 11 of my Soviet Union vlog. This time we are sticking with theme one and we're considering the government after Khrushchev. So this is the government from 1964 all the way through to 1985, mostly under Brezhnev and then briefly under Andropov and Chernenko. The way that the example spec refers to this bit as is the return to stability under Brezhnev, and then the reluctance of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko to tamper with the existing system of government. So it's clearly signaling to you that this is what they see as a period of continuity, a period of, well, change, but kind of change back to stability and a lack of reform. And because of that, you're likely to see change continuity questions, perhaps reflecting on the differences and similarities with Khrushchev's government before that, maybe why things were so stagnant in this particular period. Let's talk about Brezhnev. In 1964, Khrushchev was ousted, and in fact, he was allowed to retire away to the country and kind of step back from public life. And if you're looking for one more way in which life had changed since the death of Stalin in 1953, that is another way in which Khrushchev is allowed to remain alive. In fact, a way that things have changed since the execution of Beria, well, in the aftermath of the death of Stalin. So in 1964, Khrushchev is ousted, and Brezhnev at that time had the top role in the party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. By contrast, Alexei Kosygin had the top role in the state. So just like Khrushchev, like 8 years before, Brezhnev had the top role in the party, and so relies on the party for his support base. However, Brezhnev and Kosygin initially kind of work in some sort of alliance. They don't really get on too well, but it's a marriage of convenience, I suppose. And positions are split between their supporters. Eventually, in 1970, Kosygin is ousted or pushed aside, and Brezhnev becomes president of the Soviet Union and top dog from then on. He promotes his cult of personality increasingly through the 70s, becomes a bit of a kleptomaniac, sort of collecting awards, medals for wars he didn't fight in. He promotes his supporters, he gives jobs to his family. The whole thing becomes kind of sort of corrupt and bloated. And Brezhnev becomes, although his cult of personality is real, it becomes a slight kind of figure of fun. You sort of see certainly the respect given to Brezhnev far lower, diminishing through time, far lower than it would have been to Stalin, perhaps even Khrushchev in the early 60s. Brezhnev is initially picked as the next leader because, unlike Khrushchev, he is going to offer predictability and stability, but also, unlike Stalin, he is going to offer a moderate view on things and not be the sort of radical purger that Stalin had been. So what does Brezhnev get up to? Well, he says that Lenin and Stalin had actually completed the socialist revolution. And so what's needed from their government at this stage in history is stability. And they need to kind of maintain things as they are because, in essence, the revolution had been finished. With that in mind, Brezhnev reversed the decentralization that Khrushchev had introduced. He ended the agriculture industry split that Khrushchev had implemented. He abolished the fixed term positions that Khrushchev had brought in. You remember the 3-year fixed positions and then the rotation. And instead promoted what was called the stability of cadres. Cadres spelled Cadres. And that basically meant you had a job for life. If you wanted it and you're in that position, then you could stay there until you left. This, of course, leads to problems later on because there's no real incentive to improve, to work hard, to make any sort of changes. All you have to do is turn up and keep things the same, and keep the lights on and maintain things. It also means that there's disaffection below because I know that there's no way that my boss is ever going to be forced out or promoted. and so I don't have any prospects for improving my own position. So those are his initial policies. In 1977, a new constitution was brought in, and there's not lots to say about that, I would say. It said that it did explicitly say that the Soviet Union now was a socialist state, and what that means is that we've finished, we've reached socialism on our journey there. However, unlike Marx, who said that once he'd got to socialism, then the state could step back and allow people to work together, and eventually you'd have communism with no government. There's no mention of that at all. No sign of the state being withering or reducing its scale. And Article 6 of the Constitution also recognised the party's leading role in Soviet society, really establishing that pecking order of party over state. And that, of course, relates back to Brezhnev's getting his job because he was party leader. So, impact of this way of leading. Well, number one, what's called the gerontocracy. And gerontocracy merely means rule by old men. To illustrate, obviously, people stay in post. They stay in post forever. They're all getting older. They're all getting older together. And there are only 2 promotions to the Politburo between 1964 and 1971, and all the others are just the same old men that they had been earlier. The average age in the Politburo, therefore, grew from 58 in 1966 to 75 in 1982. In the Central Committee, the average age rose from 52 in 1961 to 62 in 1981. So to be fair, that's rising 10 years in 20 years. So there must have been some turnover because I guess people died, but limited turnover certainly. It also led to corruption because, as I said, people have no incentive to strive to work hard for promotion, nor do they have fear of being removed. And so even if things have gone wrong, there's no repercussions for your job because you've got that job for life. The black market grew hugely in this time. Yuri Skolev, Skolov is Skolov, the director of a major Moscow food store, took bribes from rich customers for passing on luxury foods. That's one good example of the black market. Famous example of corruption, Galina Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev's daughter. Galina is Galina, and her lover, Boris the Gypsy. Boris the Gypsy, that's what he's called in all the books and all the literature and things, smuggled millions of pounds worth of diamonds out of the Soviet Union, and that went unchecked through Brezhnev's lifetime. Also leads to a growing cynicism amongst the general population around communism and the Communist Party. Because under Lenin and Stalin, and to an extent Brezhnev, they've been looking forward to, they've been promised there, if you work hard, we will achieve great things. But Brezhnev's basic line was, we've already achieved socialism. So people do start to look around and say, well, is this it? Is this what we've been working so hard for? And if this is it, why is it so bad? And so there's a growing kind of cynicism amongst people and disaffection with communism and the Communist Party. That said, Communist Party membership does grow to 17 million by 1980, although I suspect people are joining more for the benefits rather than because of the ideals. So Brezhnev died in 1982, and Andropov was the next leader of the Soviet Union. He succeeded in November 1982 and lasted till February 1984, but the last 7 months of that, he was in hospital. After him came Chernenko. He was already 72 when he took power in 1984, and he lasted 13 months. Again, he was quite ill for most of that time. So they are also great examples of that gerontocracy and the damage that it did to the Soviet Union. Both Andropov and Chernenko were cut from the same cloth as Brezhnev and didn't really believe in major reform, and they weren't really well enough to institute major reform. That said, Andropov does have a go at some tidying up type reforms, and he therefore replaced a quarter of senior officials, which I guess is quite good going in what amounted to just over a year in power, really. So a quarter of senior officials were replaced, and he attacked corruption. Boris the Gypsy was prosecuted, and also some Red Army generals and the Minister of Interior, Nikolai Shchelokov. Shchelokov is Schchelokov. These are kind of an acknowledgement. These prosecutions and the replacement of credit, that things have gone too far. They've drifted. The things have become too stable, too stagnant, and they need to shake things up a little bit. But it is all quite brief, and basically you can paint this era as one of stability tending towards stagnation. And that, of course, as we'll see later on in the vlogs, is where Gorbachev picks up the story in 1985 and why he has to, or feels like he has to, act so radically at that time. So, just in finishing, let's think about Khrushchev and Brezhnev and the change continuity here. The changes are kind of easy to see, I guess, aren't they? That Khrushchev tried to de-Stalinize with his big secret speech and actions after that, even if he was slightly held back. Brezhnev restores Stalin's reputation basically as it had been. Khrushchev tried to reform through decentralizing and through limiting the amount of time people could serve in different positions. Brezhnev re-centralizes and gives people a job for life. Khrushchev took some decisions alone, increasingly so in the early 60s. For example, he started a new attack on Stalin without telling anyone in 1962. And some of his foreign policy elements, he's out there kind of banging his shoe and making speeches, also show his kind of eccentric, I guess, erratic even singular leadership, whereas Brezhnev was always a leader by consensus. He always kind of brought people with him and made decisions as a group. Khrushchev, therefore, because he's kind of out there on his own a little bit, does provoke opposition, whereas Brezhnev, to his credit, encourages stability and unity. So some really distinct differences, I think. However, there are quite a lot of similarities too, and they're kind of obvious when you think about it. Both Khrushchev and Brezhnev rely on the party for their support and their authority rather than the state. Both Khrushchev and Brezhnev, to a more or less successful degree, cultivate cults of personality for themselves. Both Khrushchev and Brezhnev leave the basic structure of Soviet government in place, a one-party state, a centralized economy, and the secret police. And, of course, neither Khrushchev nor Brezhnev resort to mass terror as it had been instituted under Stalin and to a lesser extent under Lenin as well. Overall, therefore, the differences between Khrushchev and Brezhnev, I would say, are significant, but tend to be a little bit more superficial. I would say they're more about how things looked and the kind of the big headlines, whereas the similarities tend to be more fundamental and therefore I would say more important because the basic structure of Soviet government remained unchanged, even though the flavour of it was different. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you next time. Next time we'll look at Khrushchev's economy and then Brezhnev's economy and do a similar thing with them.